Says murdered, Aurora. Says respawning, Jackson, Elijah, Amelia, Venatici, Vela, Sophia, Lily, Fomalhot, Guest, Lacerda, Cassiopeia, Lyra, James, Evelyn, Lucky, Aurora, Bootes. Says murdered, Capella. Says murdered, Ella. Says murdered, Lyriel. Aurora. Says murdered, Sirius. Says murdered, Lily. Says murdered, Fomalhot. Says murdered, Guest. Says murdered, Lucky. Says murdered, Gianna. Says murdered, Sophia. Says murdered, Oliver. Says respawning, Vela, Fomalhot, Guest, Lacerda, Cassiopeia, Ella, Lily, Sirius, Oliver, Capella, Aurora, Nova, Lucky, Lyriel, Hadar, Sophia, Gianna. Says murdered, Harper. Says murdered, Evelyn. Says murdered, Vela. Says murdered, Sirius. Says murdered, Lacerda. Says murdered, Jackson. Says murdered, Charlotte. Says murdered, Spica, Aiden, Canopus, Gemini. Says murdered, Ava. Says murdered, Lily, Guest, Capella. Says murdered, Nova, Cassiopeia. Says murdered, Liam, Gianna. Says murdered, Lucky. Says murdered, Shala. Says murdered, Oliver, Canopus, Oliver, Shala, Jackson, Pig, Nova, Lily, Guest, Vela, Gianna, Aiden, Aurora, Capella, Gacrix, Cassiopeia, Lucky, Spica, Sirius, Amelia, Liam, Lacerda, Charlotte, Evelyn, Gemini, Ava, Lyriel. Says respawning, Vela, Shala, Spica, Capella, Canopus, Sirius, Lyriel, Aiden, Elijah, Oliver, Aurora, Lily, Evelyn, Lacerda, Liam, Ava, Origa, Logan, Harper, Amelia, Guest, Cassiopeia, Gacrix, Lucky, Nova, Borealis, Sebastian, Jackson, Charlotte, Gemini, Gianna. Says murdered, Ella. Says murdered, Aldebaran, Adora. Says murdered, Grayson. Says murdered, Ellie, Bootes. Power out, requested by Murderer. says murdered. Gacrix, Lyra, says murdered. Lily, says murdered. Amelia, Lacerda, Hadar, says murdered. Lyriel, says murdered. Jackson, says murdered. Elijah, Cassiopeia, says murdered. Gianna, says murdered. Fomalhaut, Sophia, says respawning. Harper, Amelia, Jackson, Lyriel, Lucas, Elijah, Oliver, Aldebaran, Hadar, Capella, Orega, Vela, Vega, Lily, Adara, Lacerda, Cassiopeia, Lyra, Sirius, Gacrix, Aurora, Boötes, Spica, Nova, Canopus, Ellie, Gianna, says murdered. Boötes, Hadar, says murdered. Ava, says murdered. Grayson, says murdered. Adara, says murdered. Lucas, says murdered. Aurora, says murdered. Evelyn, says murdered. Lyriel, says murdered. Amelia, Sirius, says murdered. Harper, says murdered. Orega, says murdered. Jackson, says murdered. Oliver, says murdered. Spica, game mode ending soon. Says respawning. Jackson, Capella, Guest, Liam, Vega, Grayson, Amelia, Oliver, Vinatici, Gemini, Cassiopeia, Aurora, Adara, Evelyn, Boötes, Sophia, Nova, Ella, Harper, Hadar, Lyra, Gianna, Power out, requested by Subro Orbis. Game mode ending in 10 seconds. New game mode, murderer mode, starting in 10 seconds. Murderer mode. Avoid murderer and listen if he is close by. If he catches you, you're eliminated until the game mode ends. One life only. Don't get caught. Says respawning. Subro Orbis. Power restored. Requested by Subro Orbis. Says murdered. Taurus. Says murdered. Liam. Says murdered. Sophia. Says murdered. Amelia. Says murdered. Gemini. Says murdered. Sebastian. Says murdered. Venatisi. Says murdered. Ellie. Says murdered. Vela. Says murdered. Gakrix. Aiden. Aurora. Shala. Charlotte. Oliver. Says murdered. Jackson. Says murdered. Cassiopeia. Says murdered. Chroma. Says murdered. Boodis. Says murdered. Grayson. Says murdered. Ella. Says murdered. Elijah. Says murdered. Hadar. Says murdered. Vega. Says murdered. Subro Orbis. Says murdered. Evelyn. Comma game mode ending soon. Comma game mode ending in 10 seconds. Says survivors. Says survivors. Lyra, James, Villager, Regulus, Sophia, Canopus, Guest, Adora. Keep surviving to earn XP and avoid being caught. Says respawning. Subro Orbis. Says murdered. Mia.